All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days, your busy schedules to join us for this webinar about understanding logic models. We know that this is a complex issue, but it's very important to include logic models in federal grant applications. So we're here with Julie Assel to kind of make that process a little bit more easy to understand and do. I'm with the Green Lights Grant Initiative. We work with Camilla and Matthew McConaughey and their Just Keep Living Foundation to put on this initiative and to make sure that we can share as many resources as possible with school districts around the country to submit high quality grant applications. So just a little bit of housekeeping. This will be recorded and shared after the webinar. We plan to share it tomorrow with everyone, along with the slides and additional resources from Julie Assel. So with that, here's a video from Matthew, and we'll get started.
Hey everybody, McConaughey here with the Green Lights Grant Initiative. I want to welcome you to the Understanding Logic Models webinar. Today you're going to learn about logic models, which are commonly required in federal grant applications because they quickly show reviewers what the program is proposing to do and achieve. This webinar is going to describe the most common elements and formats of a logic model and explain how to use a logic model as a planning tool during the design phase of a grant application. Thank you for joining. In the meantime and all times, just keep living.
Well, hello, everyone. And I wanted to welcome you today to Understanding Logic Models. My name is Julie Assel, and I've been a writer in the McAllister and Quinn Network for about 12 years, and I've been writing and managing grants for about 23 years. I hold the Grant Professional Certified Credential through the Grant Professional Certification Institute. I am a Certified Grant Management Specialist through the National Grants Management Association and an Approved Trainer through the Grant Professionals Association. Next slide. I am delighted to join you today because I love logic models. They provide a snapshot of a project at a glance, and they allow you to see what a project expects to accomplish. And this is one of the reasons logic models are required in so many federal grant applications. But the reason I really love logic models as a grant professional is actually due to its great use as a project planning tool. So today we're not only going to talk about the common elements of a logic model, we're also going to talk about then how to use this tool for program planning before you write a grant. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the variations on a logic model that you can use for program evaluation. And as they mentioned earlier, there'll be some additional handouts we'll send out to you that will give you maybe some templates or some opportunities for you to think about different ways that logic models can be presented. Next slide. So I'm going to start out with the basics, right? What is a logic model? Next slide. The quick answer to this question is that a logic model is a tool to clarify and, in essence, graphically display what you and your project intend to do, and of course, what it hopes to accomplish and your ultimate impact. Now, I subscribe to the Kellogg Foundation's definition of a logic model, and that is a logic model is a systematic and visual way to present and share your understanding of the relationships among the resources you have to operate your program, the activities you plan, and the changes or results you hope to achieve. So what is the difference, right? The first summary really just relegates the logic model to being a picture, right? It's a graphic representation. But the second definition really points more toward its purpose and its uses. Sure, it's still visual, but it's also systematic. You don't just put things in boxes willy-nilly. You're sharing your understanding of how the components of a logic model relate to each other, really how they interact. But one of the challenges to a logic model is the fact that funders don't all use the same format. And that's absolutely true with the federal agencies as well. If you don't have a solid foundation of what these definitions are supposed to mean, it can get confusing when, frankly, funders use them incorrectly or inconsistently. Next slide. This is the most basic logic model. It shows goals, objectives, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. In general, the 3 items on the left are what you're planning to do, and the 3 items on the right are what you expect to happen. Sometimes it is just simply a change of wording between the 2 sides. Other times, the differences can be more nuanced. Next slide. The goals are broad statements about what you seek to achieve with a project or program. They should align clearly with the intention of the funder. They can be statements like close achievement gaps in first-year retention and completion rates, or in this particular case, close the achievement gap for underrepresented minority students in math. I love the explanation I once heard, which said, goals are kind of like what you wish the world would be like. And that is what you're trying to accomplish with your program. It's kind of high ideals. Next slide. But like all high ideals, you have to start coming down to earth and saying, yes, but what will this project really focus on? What are the steps we need to achieve these goals? Note, this isn't the details of how you're doing it yet. And in fact, that is one of the ways I write my narrative. For example, I might say, ABC institution is going to close the achievement gap in math for underrepresented students. In order to achieve this goal, we will achieve the following objectives: increasing the interest in math of high school students of color, increase the preparation level of math of high school students of color, decrease summer learning loss in math for high school students of color, and increase the number of students of color passing Calculus 1. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that in our training, we won't be able to show a full logic model for this great example project because of the restrictions of the size of slides, but you will be able to get the idea as we go. Okay, next slide. Now, as we start to get to what you're actually doing is the activities, right? What activities will you do that you believe will lead to the outcomes and ultimately help you meet your goal? In this logic model format, the activities are in the middle of the graphic. You will state what specific activities you plan to do to actually increase interest, preparation, decrease learning loss, and increase passing grades. This is what actions you will use to achieve the desired results. Now, ideally, each of these activities are backed up by research, either evidence levels from places like the Department of Education's What Works Clearinghouse, or even research literature, which points to these activities as being the ones most likely to be successful with your target population. So all of these boxes along the left are what you propose to do. This is straightforward enough if you're simply filling in the form for an attachment after your proposal is written. But I would tell you that it is much more simple for an organization, and frankly, the one who's writing the proposal, if this logic model was filled out, even if it's just the left side, before a single word of the proposal was written. And this is where logic models are great for program planning. Now, I don't know about all of you, but it's not unusual for me to be brought into a federal grant project when the ideas are just starting to flow, definitely before they're being finalized. And there might be some general ideas, but chances are someone actually hasn't gotten to the details yet. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go to a goal similar to our earlier example about closing the graduation gap for students of color. Next slide. So what does this goal really mean? Well, remember, I said earlier that goals should tie to the mission of the funder. And as someone who's written to a variety of federal grants to places like the Department of Education, the National Science Foundation, and some of the same places that you're looking at for school safety and mental health grants, these agencies may have several different programs that seek to address this issue. Now, there are many ways to address the challenges that school districts encounter. Each institution writing a grant should think about what they're going to do to support this goal. And you want to bring your strengths as an institution to the project as well. So as you think about the goals and the activities, they should reflect those strengths that you have as an institution. But these objectives and activities should also reflect what their organization's data tells them. And frankly, not all of them do this well. For example, the strategies you may choose to implement would probably be different if you were seeing students of color dropping out as a junior or senior than if you would if you saw them dropping out as sophomores or their freshman year. It might also be worth taking a look at the majors they're pursuing. For example, one program I worked with saw that students of color were dropping out at the end of first semester of their senior, which is kind of odd, right? It turns out that it wasn't for academic reasons at all, but because they couldn't afford to not work while student teaching. Another program found out that students were dropping out as juniors. These were students who were encountering some of the most difficult lab science courses in a major like organic chemistry. It used to be that colleges were proud to have those weed out courses that only kept in the most deserving from obtaining a particular degree. But now most institutions absolutely want their students to be successful in their major of choice and graduate from college. The institution had previously only had tutors for the initial classes of the major because they thought if you were successful as a freshman or sophomore, you were probably going to be just fine with some hard work as a junior and senior. In another grant, students were dropping out during their sophomore year because they only had a single plan to major in a particular subject. When they realized they didn't actually like the courses, they dropped out instead of changing their major because there had been no one there to help them successfully make that transition. And did you know that most students who leave college actually drop out during or just after their freshman year? The courses were harder than they thought. They were getting lower grades than they had hoped. They struggled to balance academic work and other priorities, or they just weren't able to keep up with their financial payments. School wasn't just fun as they thought it was going to be. They just weren't sure what they were going to major in now that they've changed from their initial major. All of these are examples of data points that you really have to dig into the why of what your data tells you. And we've had a great opportunity to be able to present information to you guys about data and how to examine data. So as you think about how you select your activities, you really want to think about what you're trying to accomplish, what your data is really telling you, and narrow down to say, okay, to be able to achieve this goal, we're going to achieve these outcomes, we're going to do these activities. Next slide. So I believe that using a logic model with program planning is the solution, but you may not always go from left to right. And in fact, you may not even use this exact format for a logic model at all. Next slide. Now, this is a logic model that was given by a federal funder. It looks completely different, right? At least in its shape, not those standard boxes like you could do it in an Excel, right? Here, it also asks for more specificity on the need or the problem side of the logic model. Their definition of a logic model is also slightly different, with more of an emphasis on the problem. But remember, a logic model is simply, in its most basic format, a graphic representation that clearly lays out the logical relationships between the problem, the program activities, the outputs, and the outcomes. So this template can help you see how the pieces really connect with arrows. Here you can see that the problem leads to the goal and sub-problems lead to the objectives. Next slide. So if our data shows that the problem is that 70% of white students and 50% of students of color successfully graduate within 4 years, then that leads to a goal of reducing that disparity. But it is in the sub-problems that our objectives are really born. If students of color in, let's say, a physics program are struggling in their freshman calculus class, quantitative data may simply show more of them are getting D's or F's or withdrawing from the course. But qualitative data gathered through conversations with students, maybe that are coming into a tutoring center, may help an institution learn that students are unprepared for the speed at which math is taught at the college level. So in a situation like that, one objective may be to increase the number of students who are passing the calculus course, but you may have either sub-objectives or additional objectives depending upon the activities you choose to address on this issue. This is absolutely relevant of sub-objectives because what we know as educators is that there are a lot of different factors that affect students' mental health and their safety, things that happen in the building and things that happen in families and communities. All of those may lead to maybe sub-objectives that you take a look at, and then objectives, and all the way up to your goal. Next slide. Perhaps using this data, one of your activities is to develop a club at the local high school, using students to help other younger students understand their concepts earlier, or develop ways to teach them how to grasp concepts more quickly. Or maybe you realize that your local high school has struggled to have high-level math classes taught by a certified teacher for years. And so tutoring from college students would be helpful. And we know that those mentoring relationships for students with mental health challenges can be a real game changer. Perhaps you develop or implement a summer bridge program for students who earn a B- or lower in their highest math class to help them not experience summer learning loss between high school and college, or to give them a jump start on the most challenging concepts taught in the first semester. Again, a parallel to some safety or mental health might be an opportunity to provide counseling services during the summer break. Perhaps you set up an early alert system for students. In this example, maybe they're struggling in the class, to have professors refer students to a tutoring center early in the semester before they get too behind, running that same parallel to students with mental health challenges or challenges they're experiencing at home that are then causing them to have challenges that are being expressed at school. Teachers can make referrals to the counseling office, or the counseling office can make referrals to outside providers. Now, all of this probably seems pretty straightforward, right? You're simply filling out boxes based on what you know, column by column. But there are several things you can look at right here before even going on by switching again to a different kind of logic model. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, all organizations should build on their strengths when creating a program. But sometimes you need to pay for those strengths or resources. And writing grants is a common way to pay for these resources. So you want to think, what will you need to implement the activities? These can be resources you already have, or one the grant will help you fund. Next slide. As you make a list of resources or activity inputs, questions you can ask your team include kind of the standard W questions like, who will provide this activity? What evidence do you have that the activity will work? Who will participate in the activity? Remember that your participants have strengths too. Too often we show our participants as only need as an institution, which creates, frankly, something called a savior complex in grants. Instead, showing your participants as having strengths actually points to them being invested in your program with strengths of their own. And the last one is, where will the activity take place? You might have things going on in your school. You might have them going on in the community. You might even have the opportunity to be working with community partners. Next slide. So what are some ideas or for resources or inputs for these activities? Does anybody have anything they'd like to throw out? And just drop them in the chat. What kind of activities do you think of when you think of a club? Maybe a facilitator, a tutor, right? A place, a building. Okay. Maybe some of you might be thinking, well, if I was doing an after school activity, I might be thinking of putting things in, I might be having an after school snack for students. Okay. So those are some options for you to just kind of brainstorm on your own. Next slide. Here I have listed some typical options, but I haven't provided answers to all of the questions in the space. Sometimes you have to pick or choose, and the ones you want to highlight the most based upon your space, okay? So as an example, under Math Club, you might think, what high schools will be served? What materials will they be using? Will a bus take students home after school? Is there research that supports that a math club will help? For peer tutoring, what curriculum will they use? Is it where is the peer tutoring taking place? What materials or curriculum are they using? Again, and what research supports that peer tutors will help? With a summer bridge program, who is actually receiving the activity and what is the research that that program will help? And with tutoring, who is providing data to the early alert system? Who's getting that early alert and then talking to the student? And what is the research that supports that, again, the early alert system will help? Now, if you think about this, have any of you had to change a grant proposal at the last minute because someone didn't do the budget until the very end and then realized, oops, the grant isn't going to be able to pay for all of the planned activities? I have. It's one of the reasons that I actually like to use this version of a logic model. By using this version, I'm making sure that the planning team have thought through all of the costs that they actually need to implement the project before I spend a lot of time writing out that detailed narrative. I've also done the reverse too, right? If organizations start out by handing me a budget to a program that they want me to write grant proposals for, I go down the line and I say, okay, what activities does this connect to? And speaking of activities, if we look at these activity boxes, one of the reasons many people don't think of using a logic model for program planning is because they get stuck thinking of these boxes in a chart that needs to fit on a single page, okay? So those are all things for you to think about as you kind of back and forth. Next slide. One of my personal favorite ways to do a logic model for program planning is to use these really long whiteboards in classrooms, right? I had a couple of former colleagues who called me up one day and said, hey, we want to get the old team together to write this really great grant project. Can you help us out? And having worked with them before and experienced, frankly, some of their crazier ideas, I said yes, on one condition. We would meet in a location with a giant whiteboard and I would run them through this logic model exercise. And if I was happy with the information I gathered that way, and we were there for a good 3-hour meeting, I would agree that I thought that they had the project really well enough thought out to be competitive for the opportunity. And so that's what we did. And one of the areas I really focused in on was activities. I wanted to be able to leave that meeting with pictures really on my phone of this giant whiteboard and this really large detailed logic model that I could then go back to my office and start outlining the primary elements of the project. So this piece of a logic model is really a zoom in of one of the activities. You can see that I've split the activities up into 3 categories: startup, implementation, and evaluation. And I've actually borrowed that idea from something called a work plan, which is similar, but not quite the same as a logic model. Both are really great to work hand in hand together for program planning. Some federal agencies will also ask you to put together a work plan. So again, this is a good way for you to be thinking and be prepared for different things you may see from federal funders. So I ask my team kind of some additional questions when I use this expanded view, which include things like, when in their interactions with the organization will this activity happen? This leads to a sequence of events or a timeline. How often will the activity take place? This is something called frequency. And how long will the activity take place? That's duration. And you can see that I've provided more details in my resources section when I have more room as well. One of the tendencies I find in my grant writing is towards something called passive voice. I encountered this in projects where I struggle to get the information because I don't know who is actually doing the activities. So again, this is a great logic model view to help that problem head on. Next slide. So the next thing we're going to do is really review the parts of the logic model that are on the right. Okay, next slide. Just in case you thought I missed that right-hand side of our logic model earlier, I didn't. This side of the logic model focuses on the intended results. In fact, some agencies call the left side a theory of action and the right side a theory of change. So the first element we need to examine is the one that is the most confusing, and that is outputs. Outputs are the direct result of program activities. For example, this may be just a counting of activities, how many people you will believe will attend the activity, how many sessions you'll hold, etc. Now, there are 3 reasons this name is confusing. First, output and outcome start with the same beginning of out. Second, there's another name for outputs, which is called process outcomes. Yeah, confusing, right? Outputs, wait, are they different from outcomes or are they not? Process outcomes. This is ultimately, you are measuring your process, or another way to say this is, how are you measuring how well you're implementing your activities? Third, many organizations are still only measuring outputs in their programs, but frankly, they've been calling them outcomes for years, if not decades. Unfortunately, many funders, including federal agencies, make this confusing by not asking about outputs at all. But they're very important in something called formative evaluation, meaning that these are the leading indicators for you to examine on a regular basis to see how well you are implementing your program. And if you aren't implementing it well, then how can you possibly expect to achieve your outcomes? You will, as you take a look at federal grant requests for proposals or notices of request, RFPs, they have all these different names. As you take a look at them and you take a look at what they're asking you to measure, they are often called performance measures. Some of them are going to be outputs. They're going to be a counting of things. Others of them are going to be outcomes. Next slide. So our second column along the right is called outcomes, right? These are typically a change in participants, an increase in knowledge, an improved attitude, a new behavior change after they've done the activities, or even if you're doing more systemic work, a change in policy would also be an outcome. In schools, a lot of times this is not unfamiliar to you, right? Because we measure a lot of changes in knowledge. Sometimes we measure changes in attitude, and obviously we want there to be changes in action or behavior. Next slide. Now, outcomes should be SMART: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And I know that we've already had a question come through that asked whether the logic model goals and objectives need to be SMART. And I would tell you to take a cue from your particular funding agency in order to determine this, because In the end, you want to respond to the language of each federal agency and each grant opportunity that you're applying to. So as you take a look at that, if they are asking you for measurable goals or measurable objectives, then at that point you want to take a look at having them be SMART. But it's not uncommon for objectives to be written more in a little bit of a general way, like increase this particular thing, and not so much the specific aspect that we're going to go into with outcomes. Okay. Specific, next slide, means naming your specific target population. Who is being served by the activities? Measurable means quantifying the change, not just saying increase, but by how much, right? Quantifying that change to make with your target population. You really want some numbers here, right? Attainable means don't promise too much. Some would say under promise and overperform. I would tell you to really determine what is attainable based on historical data. Or if you are new to delivering the service, what does research say you should be able to accomplish by implementing your activities? Relevant means how does this outcome relate to the problem, to your mission, to the funder's purpose? Do your outcomes agree with the funder's theory of change, where they're describing what they're trying to accomplish with their funding? Are you putting in outcomes? Are they relevant to the performance measures that they're then reporting back to Congress? Okay. Time-bound means what can you accomplish in the particular time frame specific to the grant? And this gets tricky sometimes because the federal grant year, according to the budget, is October 1 to September 30th. Theoretically, you should have data in enough time, arriving maybe over the summer, to be able to complete that final report. But I've also been in situations where people have struggled to get the timing right. So that's something for you to keep in mind. Are you implementing this over a 6-month period, over a year, over 3 years, over 5 years? And of course, you're taking a look at how many years worth of funding you're receiving from your federal agency. Okay, next slide. As we examine the outcomes in our example, you can actually see how this looks. One way to make an outcome measurable is to state the change in terms of how many of a target population will feel about something, right? This is the attitude. For example, 20% more students will express interest in a math major on a survey given at the beginning and end of a program. There's your time, right? Or you can state that a certain percentage of students will achieve, like the last 3 examples, right? 50% of tutored students will earn a B or better on a semester grade in their math class. Again, that semester gives you the time piece. In the first example, students experienced an attitude change of majoring in math. In the subsequent examples, they achieved a certain level. Now, just in case you can say, oh, that's easy because it's about education, I've used this kind of example for arts or human services with outcomes like 80% of concert attendees say they plan to attend another performance on a post-concert survey, or 50% of housed families maintain their housing for at least 6 months after assistance, as measured by a follow-up phone call. One of the challenges, though, is if you have a project in which your team wants to measure everything, right? The key is to focus in on what the funder cares about for outcomes and what is the most relevant to your organization. You have to kind of have that parallel. You may be interested in changing attitudes, but if you don't have research that says that changing attitudes is important, then perhaps you take that one out, or you simply don't include it in your grant proposal. Now, another aspect of the outcomes listed here are an answer to the question, How will you know that there was a change? This leads to providing information about the measurement tool. This is an important aspect of how we know it is measurable, right? We give them a survey or a test to see the change. Next slide. And time bound is what really drives us to another confusing aspect of outcomes. Just like I split apart activities earlier, outcomes can also be split apart as short, medium, and long term. People frequently ask me, well, what are the time lengths for each of the three? But it really does depend on the program and the funder. For example, if I'm implementing a 1-year project over the course of a school year, my short-term outcome might reflect what I can accomplish in that first 1 to 3 months of a project. A good example would be providing training to staff, right? My medium-term outcome might reflect what the project can accomplish in 3 to 6 months period. And I'm starting to get a little bit more towards my process outcomes here and seeing like what might be someone's first or second quarter grades. And then what are the long-term outcomes? This then reflects that full 9 to 12 month time frame of a project. That said, if I'm writing a 5-year federal grant, my short-term outcomes may be what I can accomplish in the first year. Medium-term outcomes might be year 3. And long-term outcomes, which I can still effectively measure and evaluate, are really the overall accomplishments of the project for the full 5 years. Next slide. Now, if these long-term outcomes, you find them to be a little bit more theoretical as you're talking to your group, putting together your project, and you're not really sure that you can commit to measuring them, they can also be listed as impact. Here you see students are leaving, which you might be able to measure. But let's say you don't do an exit survey, so you don't know why. But impact says, well, we think it's logical to assume that fewer will leave due to poor performance in these target courses. So you haven't measured it, but it kind of draws a natural conclusion in the mind of the reviewer. Note, I don't replace my outcomes, but typically it's projecting out a little bit further than you might measure. And there are elements of an outcome missing here. There's no measurement tool, no time, etc. Impacts also allow you to say things like long-term with our intervention. This will be the individual's long-term impact, or this will be the long-term impact on the broader community. This should align back to the problem, where I love to say, long-term and without intervention, this is what's going on with individuals. So perhaps our problem was not only that students of color weren't achieving at the same rate as other students, but that might also point to retention problems at the university, not just in the major. But if I'm a math department chair, I can tackle my own little piece of the educational continuum, right? But you can see that impact is really designed to parallel goals along the left. The same is true with outcomes and objectives. And this is why someone has already asked the question about whether these things need to be SMART. Most of the time, the measurable aspect is on that right-hand side of the logic model, unless, again, taking a cue from your funder, they're asking for it to be measurable at the beginning, okay? The left is what you plan to do. The right is what you plan to accomplish. And in the middle, you see the activities and outcomes. I plan to do these activities. This is how I'm going to measure these activities with my outputs, okay? Next slide. Now, you can also flip all of this upside down and start with program planning on the right. Next slide. The same kind of planning we were doing before can actually be started on the right as well. It's called starting with the end in mind. This is an ideal technique if you have a team that is very data-driven, or you have a funder which requires that you hit a certain target. We said earlier that our data showed an equity problem that only 50% of students of color were successfully graduating with 4 years compared to the 70% of white students. And that closer data showed that students of color in a physics major are struggling with their freshman calculus class. Quantitative data said that 25% were earning Ds, 10% were earning Fs, and 3% were withdrawing from the course. So if we start with the end in mind, we can say, well, what do we want this to be after we have intervened? Are we trying to close the achievement gap? What are the same percentages for white students? How about we say that only 15% of students of color will earn Ds, only 7% will earn Fs, and that no students of color will withdraw from the Calculus 1 course. So with that end in mind, you can see I've put kind of in the bottom of my chart here what needs to happen before this point to get to this outcome. This is when you say, what other data sources do we have? Both quantitative and qualitative. Perhaps you haven't looked at the attendance of the students, the scores on their homework assignments and tests. You haven't analyzed how many of these students are struggling at midterms or on their first test. This is one interesting difference between K-12 education right now and frankly many higher education programs. K-12 teachers are really pushed to examine the minutia of why their students are not succeeding, because there is very much an expectation that every student can succeed and graduate from high school. And we have a very uncompromising attitude about this culturally. But when it comes to college, we've kind of treated it as well, maybe college wasn't for them, or maybe this wasn't the major for them. We've made it more about the students than we have the quality of the education or the support they're receiving. And frankly, I see the same biases and barriers about safety and mental health, right? So as we apply all of this knowledge to the kinds of grants you may be asking for from within your district or your building, let go of those preconceived notions and really think about what's that ideal? What are we trying to get to? And how do we get every student there? And how do we, what other questions do we need to be asking, right? Some institutions that have small ratios would say, well, we know what the solution is, but we can't afford it, right? We have only 2 counselors. We have only we have 100 students to monitor, and those numbers just don't work, right? But any institution, if they look at their data with a lens of equity, we can start with the end in mind and say, what do we want for everyone? What supports do some students need to be successful that frankly other students might not need? It's actually about equity and equality, right? So back to our example, if we're coaching our program staff who want to see this outcome, we may then be asking them data questions to look more closely at earlier data points to find additional short-term outcomes that they can change, like 90% of students of color will pass their first Calculus 1 exam. Then we say to faculty, now what additional activities do you want to provide to help students achieve this? Here, faculty and anyone really needs to take a look at what research has taken place before and see if there's something that has already been proven to work with the target population. In this particular case, students of color in a physics major taking a calculus course. This is the most specific and the most ideal, of course. But what if it doesn't work, right? What if there isn't research on the exact thing? But what about students of color in a math course? What about students of color in college courses? What about struggling students in math courses? So as you take a look at the strategies and activities you're using to achieve those things along the right, you're basically working backwards, right? People will say, I know what I want to accomplish. Now, how do I get there? And you're going to have to take a look at the research, right? So if you're using research that isn't exactly your situation, it's best to think about how your activity may need to be changed slightly from the literature to applying it to the target population. Or perhaps you're doing research to see if the activity you're doing in research, you can, that says, well, that's with fidelity. Can we change an element of it, or can we change our target population a little bit and see if it works with the students that you may have? Next slide. Another key activity to complete is to go back to the participants and survey them about what they actually need, right? This will help you target your intervention to your specific participant need and not just a general, well, this is what other people think is needed, so it should work. We do that in grants all the time. It's not actually best practice, though. So as we think about the data mentioned earlier, right, conversations with students who came to a tutoring center helped the institution learn that students are unprepared for the speed at which math is taught at the college level. That's exactly how the same activities could be created by starting with the outcomes you want to achieve. Now, a note on this slide, I've added short-term outcomes that actually result from the sub-problems we found when we dug deeper into the issue. And not all of these outcomes are behavior or knowledge. You will find that many people are more comfortable with quantitative assessments. Here we have added, though, a qualitative data point. We've noted what measurement tool, though, we're going to use and when it will be given. Next slide. And so now we start working backward in the logic model. We add focus in on that peer tutoring activity from earlier, and we use a more detailed description. Students of color will receive peer tutoring 3 days a week for 1 hour, right? This gives you your frequency and duration. Then we ask the team, are there any other data points we can examine? But again, before that first exam, whether this activity is going to work, so we can head off problems before we have failed in our first outcome. Next slide. And this is where outputs come in. Another way I often gather outputs is to say, well, what data will we examine to know if they're participating in the activities? How can we prove it? Okay. How many students of color are participating in tutoring? How often are they participating in the tutoring? And is the tutoring having a short-term result of strong homework assignment grades? Okay. So then again, you work backwards to say, what objective are we trying to actually accomplish with this program? Next slide. There are different ways that you can phrase your objectives, but here are some ideas. Increase the success of students of color in Calculus 1. It's kind of basic, right? Increase the success of students of color in a physics major course of Calculus 1. You refined that a bit, or this one is my personal favorite. Increase the success of students in the physics major gateway course of Calculus 1, because really this points to why are we focusing on this course of action? Okay, which I do think is incredibly important. Next slide. So where do you start? Most organizations know what they want to do. So a great place to start is with the activities. You don't have to start on the right or the left. Start with what you know, right? Then you work backwards to ask them, well, what do you need? What are those resources or inputs to complete the activities? I always remind them that these resources can be ones they already have or ones they need the grants to purchase, right? This is a great way to make sure that your narrative aligns with the budget too. Typical questions might be, who will provide this activity? Who will receive this activity? What evidence do you have that this activity will work, right? What's the research? What materials will you need to make the activity happen? When in this intervention with the organization will the activity happen, right? Again, leading to the sequence of events. How often will the activity take place? There's your frequency. How long will the activity take place? That's your duration. And where will the activity take place? A couple of these questions really start, though, leading to outputs like how often, how long, as well as who will receive the activity. So then you start with what will be the change in attitude, knowledge, or behavior after they do these activities. How many of them will actually experience this change. This might lead you to a percentage. How will you know this? This leads to that measurement tool, right? We'll give them a survey or a test to see the change. And then hopefully to the research explanation, right? Well, if we do these activities, it leads to Y result, right? Then you can say long-term with our intervention, what will be the individual's long-term impact, or what will be the long-term impact on the community? This should again line back to the problem, long-term and without intervention, what happens to those individuals? And that really points to that baseline data, right? So you can see that by completing the logic model, you're actually talking to the organization about its project and all of its details, including the evidence or research base, the budget, both funding needed and resources available, the evaluation, right? This note that outputs can help you do formative evaluation and keep you on track, as well as the need. And from here, the grant practically writes itself, right? I know, it's not quite that simple. Next slide. But if you, as the one who is writing the proposal, have all the information for each of the columns and the correct stakeholders in the room, this can be a really great way to move forward with the actual pieces of each part of the narrative you need to write. Next slide. However, if you are missing items that are key components of the logic model framework, it is likely that you're going to have difficulty translating some particular key section of the grant, right? Maybe that's describing the target population, describing the project activities, or providing a timeline of key milestones. So our goal today really was to break apart these pieces, these items piece by piece, to help you learn how to use the template of a logic model, both in the wide view, as well as some of those zooming into particular columns, to help you consider how you're going to design your program and gather information from your team on how to really thoroughly design and explain the program they want to implement. Now, I gave you the example earlier about how I did a logic model in 3 hours with my former colleagues to figure out whether they had a viable program to write a federal grant proposal. But sometimes we as the grant professionals are really coaches as we design a program. So whatever role you have in your institution, if you're the one who is really the one writing this proposal, think of yourself in that way, a coach in designing a quality program that a reviewer will read and think, I've got this. Yes, of course. Yes, this all makes sense. And it makes logical sense, right? So the logic model is one tool in a toolbox that I'm hoping to be able to give to you, not just as an attachment that okay, I've completed that required attachment for the federal agency, but also for you to be able to use this as a tool to share your understanding, that whole lot of like check for understanding idea, right? Between these different concepts. It will help everyone literally be able to see how the program is being built. And it's not uncommon. I've been known to like put a yellow highlight in a box and say, nope, we're still missing this idea, you guys, okay? Most of the time, in addition, I am not just doing this in one meeting, right? I might use one meeting to see if they have a viable program, right? But the real work of digging into each column takes time. Most of the time, I have to send the program people back out between meetings to dig up research, which shows that the actual activities produce the outcomes we're seeking to achieve, or to say, well, what data do we have to make this outcome reasonable, right? Where is our starting place that we have to say, how do we make this smart? What could we really achieve within that timeline? Okay. So next slide, questions. I know that we have a couple already in the chat. I tried to address the logic models goals and objective needing to be SMART. We've talked a little about that. But the next question that somebody said is, where is the baseline data indicated? And there are a couple different ways to do this. You could do it in the objective. You could do it in the outcome, where people will phrase it in such a way. We're going to say, again, from a measurable perspective, I have a tendency to put them in the outcome, where we say, we're going to increase by 10%. And then like I'll put in parentheses from whatever to whatever, so that my baseline can be there. I've done it in that, but in addition, in a logic model, you don't always get a clean way of putting that into the visual. I will tell you that one of the handouts that you'll be sent out is a slightly different format that is an advanced logic model that talks about the situation, the problem, the goals, objectives, and it's got a lot more details in it. And you might also put that baseline data in that problem section. You can say, well, this is where we're starting. But again, like part of this, it all depends on how much detail you have, how complex your program is, how much space you need for your logic model. Some funders and some federal agencies will require you to produce your logic model in only one page. So that's one of the reasons I gave you a variety of templates to work with as well, for you to figure out what will work best for your program. Okay. How do you know the increase and decrease if you're not sure where you started? So this, to a certain degree, goes actually to the other training that I did for the Greenlight Grants Initiative, which really talks about collecting a wide variety of data. School districts especially have a huge amount of data, but there is also data that's out there that is specific to kind of what I call open source data, right? That either school districts are required to collect, or perhaps that they may already be collecting in your community or your state. The CDC collects a wide variety of data as well. So if you go out to the Greenlight Grants Initiative's website, there's more information there about where you can gather some baseline data. Other questions? Let's see. Where do we find the various grants that are available? So the Greenlight Grants Initiative actually has a listing of some good federal grants that are available to address school safety, mental health challenge issues in schools. The names of those grants are listed on their website. You can also go out to grants.gov and take a look if you're maybe interested in things even beyond that, to investigate various topics that your school district might be interested in. How would we get in touch with Greenlight Grant Initiative with questions or to inquire about support? I'm going to pass that question off to our Greenlight Grants Initiative folks.
Yes, hi. We are happy to chat via our email, which is info@greenlightsgrantinitiative.org. Just throw in the subject line that you attended this webinar, so we kind of know what we're chatting about, but we're happy to talk further with you. And as Julie mentioned, she did a wonderful job answering the question about what grants are available. So we focus on school safety grants and mental health grants put out by the federal government. So we have those listed on the Greenlight Grant Initiative website. Those are subject to kind of the federal government's timeline. So we expect them to come out in early spring of 2024. But as Julie did a great job mentioning, there are other grants available across the federal and state levels that you can, federal levels that you can find on grants.gov, and state levels that you can find on your state's education agency.
Any other questions?
Hi, Julie. Another question here. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about SMART goals and objectives, just kind of, for those who are a little less familiar?
So the reality is that a SMART goal, if the person running the slides can go back to, there's an image of SMART. The SMART aspect are really definitions. There we go. Actually, that one right there. The SMART, by nature, you can have a SMART goal. It can be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. It is, again, that lofty aspect of what you're trying to achieve. Most of the time, a funder will not ask you to have a SMART goal, a SMART objective, and a SMART outcome. What they're really trying to do is drill down to make sure that you are being measurable. Okay. So as you take a look at a SMART goal, it may be a lofty, like I always joke with people, the very first grant I ever wrote was trying to make sure that all students were able to read by third grade, right? That was the goal. But then you have to drill into this idea, well, how do you know? So you might take that that measurable aspect as measured by the state assessment, right? All students are able to be safe in school. How do you know that, right? As measured by, right? So you take this element of SMART, because if you say all students, you've got specific. If you say as measured by, you've got measurable. Is that really attainable to have all student? Well, it's a goal. So theoretically, yes. Is it relevant to the funder that you're applying to that's a school safety grant? Yes. How do you make that time bound? All students, let's see, all students will be safe in school during the 2023-2024 school year, right? So you bring those elements. It can still be a lofty goal, but you've brought in these particular elements to make them SMART. Do they need to be SMART? Again, use your funder guidance for that. If they're asking you for measurable, that's what you're looking for. Okay. Same thing with objectives. Your objectives a lot of times are these general ideas of, well, we're just going to increase. And you've already described in your needs section that there's a problem. So the theory is that, okay, I've said I've got this, I need to make sure, like I'll use a bad example, but let's say 10 students are suspended every year for bringing weapons to school, or, something like that. Our objective is to reduce the number of students, decrease the number of students bringing a weapon to school, or, something like that. So I'm not giving the number, but if I wanted to flip that and make it SMART, I would say reduce from 10 to 0, or whatever I thought was going to be attainable. It's just that when you do an objective, a lot of times you're starting with the increase decrease word, versus on the flip side, you're not starting with increase, but you may say instead 50% of weapons will be found by our safety officers as students enter the school, instead of in lockers or during a violent situation, just as an example. Okay. Let's see what else we have.
We have another question here. What differentiates a great logic model from an average one?
Data, specificity, having evidence-based programs, having, like, for me to be able to go from, like, I mean, it sounds cheesy, but like it has to make logical sense. I've seen logic models in which people have jumped from, we're going to reduce weapons and that's going to increase mental health. how do you get there? It's a huge leap, right? But if I had an evidence base in the middle, right, that showed that, that really helps bridge that gap for people. You want a reviewer to be able to go from left to right and have them like literally nodding their head as they go, right? Okay, here's your goal. All right, I'm narrowing it down to this specific objective. This is the activity. That makes sense that you would do this activity to achieve that, to try and achieve that objective. Now, how specific do you think you're actually going to be able to do? People who leave out the as measured by part in an outcome, it always makes me wonder, do you really know what you're doing? Right? Are you really going to be able to show me that you've made a difference at the end? I like clean lines personally. Even the funny shaped one, right? It had arrows. And I've drawn all kinds of crazy logic models in my life, where like I had one objective which led to 3 activities, and then 3 activities that led to 1 outcome, and so I want to be able to follow along. In essence, it's like a story, right? I want to be able to follow the arrow and say, I can get from point A to point B to point C to point D, and it makes sense. The more crazy it looks, the more the reviewer will doubt you. I mean, just inherently. I've reviewed a lot of federal grants. The cleaner the lines, the better. There's one in the handout that's called the advanced logic model. If I have the room, I really love this one because it is a snapshot for me of what's the situation, what's the problem, what's the goal, then objective, resources, activities, outputs, outcomes, but it also lists things like, what are the assumptions that you're making? Because we all inherently make assumptions when we think we can get from point A to point B. We're making an assumption that if we eliminate guns, that violence will be reduced, right? We make assumptions that if we improve mental health, we're going to have fewer safety issues in school, frankly. But then the bottom line of that is, what's the research that backs up your activities or your claims? People who make these broad sweeping generalizations without really digging into their personal situation at their district, those are another one of those things that I always look for. I don't want just to know what your state is doing. I want to know, how do you make this real for your district, for your building? Those are the ones that I found.
Thank you, Julie. Another question here. Should we consider the logic model as an outline for the evaluation plans?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've worked with lots and lots and lots of external evaluators, and the first thing they love to do is like, do you have a logic model? Because then they know exactly what you're trying to accomplish. And I do, again, in the handout, I have one that is called an assessment logic model and another one called an outcome measurement framework that says, okay, here's your activities, here's your outcome. How are you, or your output? How are you assessing that output? What are the tools? Who's doing that? When are you doing that? Same thing with your outcome. And the outcome measurement framework has that same idea, right? What is your outcome? What is your indicator? What's your actual data source? Well, I'm going to run this report out of this data system my school district has, or I'm going to give this like the data collection method, I'm going to give this survey in October every year and again in May. And the person who's responsible for doing that will be the teacher, the counselor, like whoever that appropriate person is. And then if you are thinking about that now, you will have well thought through the whole aspect so that it's not a surprise. Because frankly, 6 months, 3 to 6 months go by between when you write a grant, a federal grant, and when you hear the result. And so sometimes you're like, what were we thinking, right? And so if you have a logic model, and you can start using like these assessment logic models or outcome measurement frameworks, it allows you to be like, oh yeah, that's what this person was going to do that. And again, that goes back to that idea of passive voice that I was talking about earlier too. If you're able to write in who's doing it, when are they doing it, what are they doing, why are they doing it, those all contribute that to that together.
Great, thank you, Julie. I think this might be the last question. Again, if there are any last minute questions, please do put those in the Q&A function. What happens if an applicant is unable to meet their outcome?
I will tell you that it really, I don't want to say depends, because that sounds like I'm just being, wishy-washy. But if you can't meet any of your outcomes, then you have a problem, right? The question would be why. But I also just went through COVID, right? I have 3, 4, and 5 year grants who absolutely did not, were not able to meet their outcomes because, they weren't even in school for a year. So it's a lot of it is how you explain why that is. Sometimes if it's related to a fiscal matter, something got delayed, they'll do a 1-year extension. Sometimes you just vastly overestimated how much of a difference it was going to make in your students, or other outside factors. If you understand that idea of SWOT analysis, right? Sometimes it's those outside things that completely derail your project, but you need to be able to express that. The other thing I would tell you is absolutely do not wait until your final report to tell your federal program officer that. Don't try to hide it and say like, oh, well, we'll just tell them at the very end. Maybe we'll fix it by then. This is really the reason I'm an advocate of formative assessment, right? Those outputs. If you know going ahead, oh, well, we're having problems with this, tell your program officer. They might be able to help you with technical assistance. There are alternatives, okay? I have a philosophy, don't surprise the funder, right? With your reporting, ever. Doesn't matter whether it's a federal funder or not, don't surprise them. Be honest.
Great, thank you very much, Julie. I believe that concludes our question and answer session. Again, please feel free to email us at the email addresses that are on the screen if you have any additional questions. Otherwise, I will now turn it over to the Greenlights Grants Initiative team for closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you, Julie, for an incredible presentation. As you mentioned throughout, understanding logic models and using them is so vital in grant writing, and we really want this to be a tool that everyone can use in their applications. Just as a reminder, this recording as well as the slides will be sent to everyone who registered for the event. If you somehow hopped on through someone else's link and didn't register, just email us at the info@greenlightsgrantinitiative.org email, and we'll make sure to get everything over to you. The additional resource that Julie mentioned will also be sent along. And then in the next couple of days, we'll have everything fully uploaded to the Greenlights Grant Initiative website. Please make sure to join us for our 5th webinar in the Federal Grantsmanship series that we'll be hosting on December 5th, How to Build a Grant Budget. We will certainly have a lot to cover on that webinar, and we know that this is a huge, vital piece of the grant application process. So we really want to make sure that we get lots of people to join just so we can answer as many questions as possible. Also coming out in the email you'll get sent after the webinar is a Google form. We would love to hear your feedback on this webinar and any of our previous webinars. So with that, we'll give you back some time in the rest of your day, and we really thank you for joining the Greenlights Grant Initiative for our webinar. Have a good day.